US President Donald Trump has doubled down on his hardline trade stand, declaring that no country, especially China, would be spared from his sweeping tariffs. The exemption of smartphones, laptops, and other electronic products from import tariffs on China will be a short-lived one. This was confirmed by the US President himself on board Air Force One when he said that no one was getting off the hook. Trump even promised to launch a national security trade investigation into the semiconductor sector. In fact, he wants an investigation into the entire electronics supply chain. This after the White House announced Friday the exclusion of some electronic devices from steep reciprocal tariffs, particularly the ones that are coming in from China.
The tariffs will be in place in the not distant future because, as you know, like we did with steel, like we did with automobiles, like we did with aluminum, which are now fully on, we'll be doing that with semiconductors, with chips, and numerous other things. And that'll take place in the very near future.
And all the things.
And what we did is we want to uncomplicate it from a lot of companies because that's really where it should be, ideally. And we wanted to uncomplicate it from a lot of other companies because we want to make our chips and semiconductors and other things in our country. And I will tell you, another one is pharmaceuticals, drugs and pharmaceuticals. We want to make our drugs in this country. And by placing a tariff on the companies that are not in this country, they're going to move into our country and we're going to have our drugs made in the United States. So that in case of war, in case of whatever, we're not relying on China and various other countries to supply us with drugs, which is not a good idea. And it'll happen very fast. It'll all happen very fast.
Do you know what rate the semiconductor tariff?
I'm going to be announcing it over the next week.
So President Donald Trump says that no one is off the hook and more tariffs are coming soon. But for now, many imported electronic items, laptops, semiconductor chips, smartphones, etc., are being exempt from President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs that were announced last week. In fact, on about 60-odd countries, he put a pause on that last week for about 90 days, except China. On China, he's slapped 145% tariffs. China has retaliated with its own retaliatory tariffs up to 125%. CNN's Mike Valero takes a closer look at how China is responding to Donald Trump's tariff tirade.
Well, in this corner of the world, we're looking for any kind of clue, any kind of indication about who is going to call whom when we're talking about U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Notable, we do know this. When China increased its tariff on U.S. goods to 125% on Friday, the United States did not strike back. Its tariff level still higher at 145%. So for a window into what Beijing is thinking in this moment, let's go to the graphic talking about China's Commerce Ministry, writing in part late on a Friday, quote, if the U.S. insists on continuing this numbers game with tariffs, China will not engage. However, if the U.S. persists in substantively harming China's interests, China will resolutely take countermeasures and fight to the end. So countermeasures, what exactly do they mean by that? Well, a lot of economists are starting to tell us that China may have reached the end of its tariff toolkit and could be reaching into its toolkit with other economic measures, pain that it could cause Americans. Think about the hypothetical of China no longer buying soybeans or crops from the American heartland, instead going to Brazil, for example. The possibility of China not exporting any rare earth minerals to the United States, key for semiconductors, the internal workings of computers and cars. For a window into what the president is thinking, let's go to the president himself. Here's some comments that he made aboard Air Force One. Let's listen in.
Honestly, I'm very comfortable now, but I've always gotten along well with President Xi. We had a good relationship, very good. And I think something positive is going to come out of that. We're going to see what happens. I mean, look, China is it's a very big, great country. It's a very good leader, very smart leader. It's a different form of leadership. It's a different form of government. But they certainly are big. But, you know, this should have been done. What I've done should have been done by past presidents.
So President Trump sounding optimistic, even though we don't really have an indication as to what's going to be next, how these talks are going to move forward.
All right, let's try and make sense of this because every day the tariff story is changing. First, there were reciprocal tariffs, then it was paused for 90 days on all countries except China. And then on Friday, we had the exemptions for electronic devices, only for Trump to say on Sunday that there will be a separate set of tariffs on semiconductors. Let's go across to Josh Lipsky. He's Senior Director at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Mr. Lipsky. So I want to start with first something that you wrote a few days ago about how this is a global economic war without any allies. Unlike any of the economic crises that we've seen in this past century, the 2008 financial crisis, the COVID crisis, all of which resulted in, deep cuts in the markets. This one is a self-inflicted one by one man. Can you try and sort of make sense from the Trump worldview as to what he's trying to achieve and whether realistically that's possible at all? And if he can't, then what's the damage he's going to leave behind in the process?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And as I wrote last week, the president has launched a global economic trade war without any allies. And you have to understand going back that tariffs are one of his core policy convictions. And this dates to the 1980s in his time in New York real estate. It's one of his original policy ideas, and he has held true to it ever since, now through the 2020s. The problem is there's not a clear strategy from the White House of what they're actually trying to achieve. We've heard different rationales for the tariffs. Is it countering China? Is it raising revenue? Is it dealing with broader unfair trade practices that they perceive in the world? And depending on what you think the goal is, then you would have a different policy. So it seems like they're recalibrating now. The original, as we all know, Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs hit everyone in the world, including India. And now they're retreating a little bit from that position and trying to get allies on board to actually counter China. But at the same time, because of the economic pain that will inflict on Americans, they're wary about inflation, the cost of consumer electronics back here in the United States, and they're worried about how much economic pain Americans would take. So what you get is a haphazard policy and countries around the world trying to understand what is it the White House wants exactly.
So on the reciprocal tariffs, he's put a pause for 90 days for most countries except China. The one country with which it's gone into this, dangerous escalatory game is between the United States and China. 145% from the U.S. side, 125% from the Chinese side. In this game of who blinks first, you think Trump, by putting an exemption for these, electronic devices, smartphones, laptops, semiconductor chips, only then for 2 days later for him to say we'll have separate tariffs on semiconductors, he's giving the indication to the Chinese president that he's willing to blink?
I think it's fair to read it as the president worried about how much economic pain Americans are willing to take. And you see the confusion over the weekend. On Saturday morning here in Washington, we got the news that there was an exemption on electronics and semiconductors. But then not 24 hours later, we were told by the White House, it's not actually an exemption because there are different kinds of tariffs coming, Section 232, as we call them. But the bottom line is those tariffs will very likely have a lower rate than the reciprocal tariffs at 145, 125%. So now we get a situation where I think from the Chinese side, they're looking at the United States and saying they probably can't tolerate as much pain as we can from the Chinese economy. And you see a little bit of the US negotiating against itself at the moment.
So what does that mean if there are going to be separate levies on semiconductors, but as you said, much lower rates than the 125 or 145? What does that mean for companies like Apple and Nvidia, Intel, etc.? Is that the tech companies finally prevailing on the White House that this is just going to raise prices for consumers, American consumers?
Well, they're certainly in a better position today than they were at this time last week when it looked like a 125% tariff coming across the board, which would hit Apple and Samsung and a range of technology companies directly, very potently in terms of their exports and how they manufacture in China. But they're not out of the woods, and so much of this is about uncertainty. We've had more volatility in our stock market over the last 2 weeks than any time since COVID or since the global financial crisis. And this creates so much business uncertainty uncertainty. Because if you're a business of any side, whether you're an Apple or you're a small or medium-sized business, you can't make long-term plans now because you don't know what tariff rate is coming next week. And I think this, as much as anything else, weighs on the economic outlook both here in the United States and around the world. So Apple and the tech companies are breathing a sigh of relief, but they also know there's no certainty coming from this White House and what might come next.
So in the next couple of weeks, starting this week, you'll have results and outlook from some of the biggest American companies. Goldman Sachs is going to be putting out their results, the first quarter results. You have Bank of America, Citigroup. You'll obviously hear from the Metas and Googles and Apples. What will you be looking for in terms of what the outlook is for the next 3 months, next 6 months, the way American businesses see it?
Well, one thing we look for is if companies start pulling their forward guidance or their earnings for Q3 and Q4. This happened during the pandemic. That would be a sign that what I was saying before is manifesting itself into companies' balance sheets where there's so much uncertainty, they can't project forward through the rest of the year, and they don't want to miss targets, so they actually stop putting targets out. That would be a warning sign. The other thing we have to look for is the bond market. It was the bond market in the United States that really put pressure on the president last week to retreat from some of the reciprocal tariffs. We have to see what bonds do in the US this week. There was an indication last week that countries and companies around the world were moving assets outside of the US for the first time we had seen in recent memory. If that continues, there will continue to be pressure here in the US. So it's the bond market, it's the corporate balance sheet, it's the forward guidance from corporates that we're looking to this week and the week ahead.
And the other kind of response we've got from a few individual countries who believe that they can sort of convince Mr. Trump to get into some kind of a trade agreement and lower the tariffs, at least the reciprocal part of the tariffs. You're seeing that approach from India, from Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, Israel, you name it. A whole bunch of countries who are, strategically, geopolitically aligned with the U.S., hoping that on this tariff issue, they can get Trump to see a little more reason, at least as far as those countries are concerned, as opposed to, the response we're seeing from China or even to a lesser extent from the European Union. How do friendly countries that are friendly to the U.S. and friendly to this current White House, play this reciprocal tariff game to their advantage?
Well, this is a complicated global game going on right now, and you're going to see it play out in real time. Next week, we have the IMF World Bank spring meetings in Washington. So every finance minister and central bank governor in the world will be here, and you will see these negotiations happening in person as many of them meet their counterparts from the Trump administration for the first time. The question is, what is the deal that's available, and how low is the White House willing to go? Because I do think it's important to say that no matter what is negotiated, the U.S. is likely to have the highest effective tariff rate, even at the end of this, than at any time in the past century. And I think the White House has been pretty clear they will not go below 10%, the current reciprocal baseline. So the question for countries around the world negotiating is how much can they offer, given where the pause is now, that actually makes it a better situation for them? And this is what has to be figured out. At the same time, what does the U.S. want vis-a-vis China? Because there's a big concern now that there's 145% tariffs on China and 10% on most of the rest of the world of transshipment, of people looking to reroute goods. And I think the White House is going to be pressing countries on that point. So every country has to come at it from their own perspective, their own domestic interest, and figure out what makes sense for them. And they're doing this at a time where the White House can only negotiate with so many partners at the same time. That's just realistic.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Josh Lipsky from the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective into which way this trade war story is moving. Clearly between China and the United States, they're ratcheting it up virtually every day, every week. And then, of course, Trump giving that exemption to semiconductors, to chips, to electronic items like smartphones and laptops, only to say that there will be separate semiconductor tariffs that he's hoping to announce sometime this week or next.